My fragile sister manipulated my best friend into dumping me by faking illnesses for his attention. 6 months later, he called drunk saying, "I lost my person, everything else is noise," begging me to come back. I hung up and realized that while they'd been playing their little games, I'd been building something they had no idea about. See, what neither Natalie nor Theo understood was that their betrayal had cost me more than just a friendship. When I'd packed up and moved to Seattle, I wasn't just running away. I was stepping into a $160,000 senior developer position at a tech company that was about to go public. The signing bonus alone was more than Theo's restaurant made in profit most quarters. But more importantly, I'd spent 6 months building professional relationships with some of the most connected people in the Pacific Northwest tech scene. My neighbor Serena worked in venture capital. My therapist Rena had a client roster that included half the city's power players. My manager Gabrielle sat on the board of 3 different startups. While Theo was dealing with Natalie's manufactured crises, I'd been quietly assembling a network of people who could make or break careers with a single phone call. The drunk call had come at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. Theo's voice cracked as he slurred, "I can't go home. Everything reminds me of you. That stupid coffee shop on 5th where you spilled that latte on your laptop. Remember how you laughed so hard you cried? I haven't heard you laugh in 8 months." He kept going, his words getting more desperate. "You know what my grandfather said before he died? He said, 'Don't lose her, Theo. Everything else is noise, but don't lose her.' And what did I do? I chose someone else. 20 years of you showing up for me, staying up all night when my dad had his heart attack, teaching me to code so we could talk about your work, and I chose someone else." I'd listened to every word while pulling up my laptop and opening the files I'd been building since I moved to Seattle. Credit reports, social media monitoring, professional background checks. You don't survive in competitive tech without learning to gather intelligence. And I'd been very thorough about keeping tabs on the people who destroyed my life. "Come back, please. We can fix this," Theo had begged. "There's no we," I'd replied calmly. "You chose her." "I chose wrong." "Yeah, you did." The hang-up had been satisfying, but it was just the beginning. Because while Theo was crying into his beer about losing his person, I was looking at financial records that told a very different story about his precious restaurant empire. Theo's family business wasn't the thriving success he'd always portrayed. According to the corporate filings I'd accessed through my professional network, both locations were leveraged to the hilt. They owed $340,000 in back taxes, had 3 liens against the properties, and were exactly 60 days behind on their primary business loan. The bank was already preparing foreclosure proceedings. But here's what made it really interesting. Theo had been using his relationship with me as social proof to secure those loans in the first place. Bank documents showed he'd name-dropped my Columbia degree and my position at the startup during loan applications. He'd even used photos of us together at tech industry events as evidence of his connections in the innovation sector. My former best friend had been leveraging our 20-year friendship as collateral for his failing business, while simultaneously choosing my sister over me. The irony was almost beautiful. Natalie's situation was even more delicious. My fragile little sister, who claimed she could only handle part-time work due to her anxiety, had been running a very profitable Instagram influence scam. She'd built a following of 47,000 people by posting about her various chronic illnesses and invisible disabilities. The sympathy donations were rolling in at about $3,200 per month. But the real money was coming from the affiliate marketing. She was promoting wellness products and medical devices to her vulnerable followers, taking 40% commissions on sales that totaled over $18,000 last quarter alone. My anxious little sister was pulling in more than $75,000 a year by monetizing fake medical conditions. The beautiful part was that she'd been documenting her own fraud. Every Instagram post about being too sick to work a regular job was time-stamped and archived. Every GoFundMe claiming medical expenses had detailed records. Every product endorsement came with FTC disclosure requirements she'd been completely ignoring. I spent the weekend after Theo's call putting together what I privately termed the Natalie files, screenshots of every contradiction between her social media presence and her actual activities, financial records showing the gap between her claimed poverty and her actual income, product endorsement posts that violated federal advertising regulations. Then I made some phone calls. My first call was to Marcus Webb, an investigative journalist I'd met at a tech conference who specialized in social media fraud. Marcus had been looking for a good story about Instagram influence scams, and I handed him a perfect case study. Natalie had made every rookie mistake: false medical claims, undisclosed paid partnerships, fraudulent fundraising appeals. "This is exactly what we need to show how these scams operate," Marcus told me during our coffee meeting. "The medical sympathy angle makes it particularly egregious. People are donating their hard-earned money thinking they're helping someone with genuine health issues." My second call was to the IRS whistleblower hotline. Turns out there's a very specific process for reporting tax fraud. An influencer income that gets systematically underreported falls squarely into their wheelhouse. The person I spoke with was very interested in Natalie's case, especially when I mentioned the scale of unreported income and the fraudulent medical claims. But the real masterpiece was my approach to Theo's situation. I didn't need to destroy him directly. He was doing a perfectly good job of that himself. I just needed to accelerate the timeline. Through my network at the venture capital firm, I learned that Theo had been desperately trying to find investors to save his restaurants. He'd been pitching a farm-to-table expansion concept to anyone who would listen, claiming he had connections in the tech industry who could help him modernize and scale the business. Those connections, of course, had been me, and now they were very much not available to him. I made a simple phone call to Jeremy Blake, a restaurant industry analyst who consulted for investors looking at food service opportunities. I'd worked with Jeremy's firm on a point-of-sale software project 2 years earlier, and we'd maintained a professional relationship. "I heard Theo Martinelli might be pitching restaurant investments in your circles," I mentioned casually during our quarterly check-in call. "I thought you should know he's been misrepresenting his industry connections. Also, you might want to look at his current financial situation before anyone gets too interested." Jeremy thanked me for the heads up and mentioned he'd do his due diligence. 3 days later, Theo's last potential investor pulled out of discussions. The word had spread through the small restaurant investment community that Martinelli's claims about his business connections didn't check out, and his financials were concerning. The dominoes started falling exactly as I'd planned. Within 2 weeks, Marcus's article about Natalie went live on a major tech publication's website. The headline read, "The Hidden Economy of Instagram Medical Fraud: How Fake Illness Influencers Make $75K plus Annually." Natalie's account was featured as the primary case study, complete with side-by-side comparisons of her 2 sick-to-work posts and evidence of her actual activities and income. The article went viral within hours. Natalie's Instagram comments exploded with angry followers demanding refunds on products she'd promoted. The companies whose products she'd been pushing immediately terminated her affiliate partnerships. 3 different people mentioned they were reporting her GoFundMe campaigns for fraud. But the real consequences came from the regulatory attention. The FTC opened an investigation into her undisclosed paid partnerships. The state attorney general's office launched a consumer fraud inquiry based on complaints from people who'd bought products based on her medical claims. And the IRS, armed with detailed documentation of her unreported income, began their own audit. Theo's collapse was even more spectacular. Without investor backing, he couldn't make the loan payments that were already overdue. The bank moved forward with foreclosure proceedings on both restaurant locations. But worse than losing the buildings, he lost his reputation in the industry. Word spread quickly through the restaurant community that Theo Martinelli had been making false claims about his business connections and financial stability. Other restaurant owners started distancing themselves. His suppliers demanded payment up front instead of extending credit. Food bloggers who'd previously given his restaurants positive coverage began publishing pieces about authenticity in the restaurant industry that made pointed references to operators who oversell their credentials. The social destruction was beautiful to watch from 350 miles away. Theo's carefully cultivated image as a successful young restaurateur crumbled in real time. Former friends stopped returning his calls. Industry events he'd previously been invited to speak at quietly removed him from their programs. But I wasn't finished with either of them. The final piece of my strategy targeted their relationship directly. I'd been monitoring their social media activity through automated tracking tools, and I'd noticed some interesting patterns. Theo had been posting increasingly desperate content about fighting for what matters and learning from mistakes. Meanwhile, Natalie had been posting subtle digs about people who blame everyone else for their problems and recognizing when someone is bringing down your energy. They were already turning on each other. I decided to accelerate that process with a carefully placed piece of information. Through an anonymous email account, I sent Theo a link to a cached version of a private Instagram story Natalie had posted 3 months earlier. In it, she'd been laughing with friends about how easy it was to make Theo feel needed, and how she just had to act helpless and he'd do whatever she wanted. The story had been deleted within hours of posting, but I'd screenshotted it when my automated monitoring had flagged it. The image showed Natalie clearly making fun of Theo's protective instincts, calling him pathetically eager to play hero. I didn't need to include any commentary with the email. The screenshot spoke for itself. 2 days later, Theo confronted Natalie about the post. Their argument happened in the parking lot of her apartment complex, and unfortunately for them, one of her neighbors filmed it and posted it to social media. The video showed Theo demanding an explanation while Natalie screamed back that he was attacking her for being honest with friends, and that she shouldn't have to perform gratitude for every little thing he did. The relationship imploded publicly and messily. Theo moved out of Natalie's apartment and back in with his parents. Natalie posted a long Instagram story about toxic masculinity and men who can't handle strong women, which rang pretty hollow given that her account was still hemorrhaging followers from the fraud allegations. Within a month, both restaurants had closed permanently. Theo was working as a line cook at someone else's restaurant, trying to rebuild his reputation from the ground up. Natalie had moved back home with our parents and was facing a $23,000 fine from the FTC, plus potential criminal charges for the GoFundMe fraud. But the most satisfying consequence was how thoroughly they'd been cut off from the professional networks they'd been counting on. Theo's connections in the restaurant industry had evaporated once word spread about his misrepresentations and financial instability. Natalie's influencer partnerships were gone, and her damaged reputation made it impossible to rebuild her following. Meanwhile, my career was thriving. The startup I joined went public 6 months after I arrived, and my stock options were suddenly worth $847,000. Gabrielle promoted me to technical director with a $35,000 raise. I'd been invited to speak at 3 major industry conferences and had job offers from companies in San Francisco and New York. The contrast was perfect. While Theo and Natalie dealt with the consequences of their choices, I was building wealth and professional status they could only dream of. 6 months after the drunk phone call, I received a LinkedIn message from Theo. He'd seen that I'd been promoted and was speaking at conferences, and he wanted to congratulate me on my success. The message was carefully worded to sound casual and friendly, but I could read the desperation underneath. He was hoping to rebuild some connection, maybe leverage our history for professional benefit. I read the message 3 times, then deleted it without responding. A week later, Natalie sent me an email asking if we could talk about family stuff and maybe work through some of our issues. She mentioned that our parents had suggested she reach out and that she was in a better place now to have difficult conversations. Her legal troubles were mounting, and she needed family support. The email was clearly an attempt to rebuild bridges before her court date. I deleted that message too, because here's what they never understood. Their betrayal hadn't just hurt me emotionally. It had revealed something crucial about their character and judgment. Theo had thrown away a 20-year friendship for someone he'd known 8 months. Natalie had built her entire adult identity around manipulating people's sympathy. Those weren't the kinds of people I wanted in my life, regardless of our history. A year later, I was living in a $2.1 million condo in downtown Seattle with my partner David, whom I'd met at a tech industry mixer. David was a patent attorney who specialized in software innovations, and our combined income was approaching $400,000 annually. We were planning our engagement and talking about buying a house in the San Juan Islands. I'd built a life that was genuinely mine, filled with people who valued my actual contributions rather than seeing me as either a resource to exploit or a problem to manage. Theo never did rebuild his restaurant empire. Last I heard, he was still working for other people, trying to save enough money to eventually open something small again. His reputation in the industry never fully recovered from the financial collapse and the stories about misrepresenting his connections. Natalie eventually pled guilty to the fraud charges and was sentenced to 2 years probation plus restitution payments. She works at a medical billing company now, doing data entry for $32,000 a year. Her social media presence never recovered, and she can't legally run any kind of online business that involves health or wellness claims. The beautiful thing is that I never had to confront either of them directly or make dramatic threats or even let them know I was involved in their downfall. I simply used the professional skills and networks I'd built to ensure that the truth about their character and choices became publicly visible. They destroyed themselves. I just provided the lighting. Sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic confrontation or elaborate schemes. Sometimes it's simply being successful enough that other people's small-minded choices become irrelevant to your life, and connected enough that the truth about bad actors spreads through the networks that matter. Theo was right about one thing in his drunk call. Everything else really is noise. But he was wrong about which person mattered and which relationships were worth protecting. I found my people. They found out they weren't mine.